Welcome to Education Perspectives. I am your host, Liza Holland. This is a podcast that explores the role of education in our society from a variety of lenses. Education needs to evolve to meet the needs of today and the future. Solving such huge issues requires understanding. Join me as we begin to explore the many perspectives of education. Will Powers is a graduate of Occidental College, where he studied diplomacy and world affairs and graduated as an Obama Scholar. He has worked for the Brookings Institution, Blue Haven Initiative, and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, advancing social impact through policymaking. Will is currently the Policy and Public Engagement Partner for the Kentucky Student Voice Team, helping lead the Rose Revival campaign and supporting high school students to facilitate series of public hearings related to issues raised in KSVT's recently filed legal complaint, Kentucky Student Voice Team versus the Commonwealth of Kentucky. Well, Will Powers, welcome to Education Perspectives.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm delighted, and I'm so excited because talk about the penultimate of student voice. We've got a lot to talk about today. But let me ask you my question I ask every guest. From a 30,000-foot view, why do you think that we as a society need to invest in education?
Yeah, so I would speak to my personal experience. I grew up in Somerset, Kentucky, which is a pretty small community in southeastern Kentucky, and I grew up in a family, very lucky to have an educated mother and a brother who was older than me going to college. So I understood then the importance of education, which was not something that everyone who I grew up with, friends or family, had received. And it was joining the Kentucky Student Voice Team in high school where I saw nearly a decade on now from joining as a high schooler, where I got to really interact with students from Lexington and Louisville for the first time. And I saw this huge disparity in opportunity, especially related to post-secondary transitions. These students were talking about going to Harvard, going to Princeton, going to Yale, things that were not even in my vocabulary as a student in Somerset. So I started to realize, oh, this is a factor or a byproduct of the kind of education they're receiving and the kind of larger culture that they grew up in, which told them these things are possible because of the education you receive. And I didn't see that reflected in Somerset, but I felt like still that could be the case. The education quality was there in the high school, but the possibilities and opportunities weren't made aware. So that really started me on this pathway.
Boy, that's exciting. And it is amazing what that group has done. Can you tell listeners who maybe are not familiar what the Kentucky Student Voice Team is?
Yeah, so the Kentucky Student Voice Team formed 13 years ago in a coffee shop with our great founder and board chair, Andrew Brennan, who I feel like anytime I say his name, about 4 people up here who know who he is. And Rachel Bellin, who's our managing partner, our adult partner, we like to call her. And they felt like, as education stakeholders, they being the students who approached Rachel, that should have a voice in education policy decision making. And Rachel agreed, and they brought this proposal to start a student group to the Pritchard Committee at the time and became the Pritchard Committee Student Voice Team. In 2021, we broke off from the Pritchard Committee and became our own independent 501c3 organization, completely youth-led, co-generationally sustained, we like to say. So I am defined as an adult partner. In many cases, I would not be an adult partner, but as a 24-year-old, I get to come back to the work and support the students while they're doing the 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. in school. And then I support them all the way up until usually midnight when they get back from their clubs and various engagements. So we do policy research and storytelling to create more just and democratic schools here in Kentucky. And we have about 120 or so middle and high school members from across the state who opt in to join. We're not like a school club or anything. People see our website, hear about it from a friend. They shoot us an email. They join us on Slack, on Zoom. We meet virtually, and then we have these in-person gatherings every now and then to either, like we were last weekend in Lexington, hosting a hearing on civic education, or where we'll be in a month at the Franklin County Circuit Courthouse at the hearing for our KSVT versus Commonwealth of Kentucky litigation.
Boy, that's so exciting. And I definitely want to dig in detail about that. But I was kind of fascinated reading your bio about some of the experience that you have gotten outside of Kentucky and or at least tangentially there. Tell us a little bit about your work, like with the Brookings Institution and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, those sorts of things, because that's a great skill set to be bringing back to Kentucky Student Voice Team.
Yeah, so I studied diplomacy and world affairs in undergrad, and I always had a an understanding that I wanted to go into. I wanted to broaden my horizons from just understanding education in the context of Somerset or of Kentucky, but in the world as a whole. And so I got involved in studying international development efforts related to Sustainable Development Goal 4, which is around the access to quality education for all, which is very similar to the Rose case and the right to an adequate education here in Kentucky. So I studied with a professor at Occidental College and studied specifically how free primary school was rolled out in Uganda. And from there, I got this perspective on how the delivery of education services is really a one size fits all in international development, and it doesn't work. And that's not just the case for international development. It's that way in the United States and within individual districts and county levels or city levels. So I saw that through line and I really wanted to discover it more. So I worked at the Brookings Institution specifically studying social impact bonds, which are these innovative finance tools to do some of these education development projects in other countries. Those specifically, the bonds that I studied were US based, and how private companies and public entities could work together to increase support for remedial learning. So, anywho, all of my work, even on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, which was very minimal, I should say that I was a freshman in college at the time, and this was just before COVID started, so I only got to do a semester of that internship. But really, I had this narrowed focus. I had never left the country until even last year, but I had really not engaged with other cultures, let alone international cultures. And I wanted to get that out of my college experience. I felt like I did that. I broadened my perspective. I learned a lot of new things, and I took those skills back with me to Kentucky into this current role. And I think we've built a network that is nationwide, but is also international. I pushed really hard for the Student Voice team to join Catalyst 2030, which is a international group of organizations and individuals working towards meeting those sustainable development goals by 2030, specifically us working on SDG 4 around the universal access to education. And I fundamentally believe that at the very least, if you're doing work in a local community or statewide, or the scope of your work is not international, the work that you're doing can be helpful to an international audience if you're letting them know the strategies that you're using to engage youth or the barriers that you had to overcome. Usually, those are barriers that people face in other countries in different contexts, but your advice and your help can be useful, and vice versa to us. So I've tried to infuse that into the work we do with the Kentucky Student Voice team, and that was definitely something I got from my work during my undergraduate career.
That's fantastic, and what a gift to the current Kentucky Student Voice team, to be able to get that kind of broadened exposure, et cetera. That's wonderful. So we were lucky enough to have Louisa on, to talk a little bit about the initial study and whatnot around the Rose decision and where you guys were coming from, but, we had not it had not gotten to the point where you were looking at legislation. So, can you tell us a little bit about why the Kentucky Student Voice team decided to actually file a lawsuit?
Yeah, so I'll try not to regurgitate what Louisa has already said, and Louisa will have said it 20 times better than I could ever put it. She is wonderful. But we embarked upon this journey a year or two ago with we like to call them the Mikes, Michael Gregory, Michael Rebell, who are our two legal advisors, reached out to us and said, Kentucky has this unique right to an adequate education in our Constitution. Is that being upheld? So they came to us with a question, and we wanted to answer that question for them. We knew we couldn't do it alone, and we knew that really 80% of that question had already been answered by the very own statistics from the Department of Education here in Kentucky and by our partner organizations. But we really wanted to dig into these 7 capacities, which are 7 components or skills that the Kentucky Constitution says each student must graduate with. Most of the analysis of the Rose case focuses on the financial aspects. How is the SEEK funding formula holding up 30 years on from CARA? And we understood that to be pretty plainly inequitable. The research that has come out from that is it didn't bear repeating from us. So we wanted to really get into what are the impacts of the funding inequities on the quality of education? So we hosted those 6 community forums across the state. We engaged over 3,000 individual education stakeholders through our surveys and interviews. We synthesized and conducted a meta-analysis of the data that was already out there from our partners on these 7 capacities. And we came to the decision with the students as our key decision maker in this, that we would be an organizational plaintiff and that we would file this case alongside 13 individual plaintiffs who are students themselves in the state of Kentucky. And we really felt fundamentally that the moment calls for systemic change. Everything in the 90s that led us to Rose is true today, if not twofold. And we believe that if the state legislature is unable to take those actions or won't take those actions, and they've not in the past 5 or 6 years, then we ought to use the other tool in our toolbox to bring about this change, which is litigation. So we filed that litigation in January, and it doesn't mean we're not going to be working in the legislative session or we're not going to be doing research or storytelling or advocacy. It actually makes those efforts even more important now. But now we have kind of a timetable that says this is when we could get a decision. In our case, we want a favorable decision. And then by the time we get that, 4 or 5 years, we want to have created a pathway for the state legislature to take to say, this is the path that Kentuckians want to go down. They want an adequate civic education, which means actually requiring a course in high school for graduation. They want adequate mental health resources, which means meeting the 1 counselor to 250 student ratio in Kentucky schools and funding that mandate. So that is what the case is about. That's what this public engagement campaign is about. It's about, we've outlined the problems, we've identified them in the legal complaint. Now, we don't want to harp on what's wrong with Kentucky's education system for the next 4 years. People know that. We want to talk about the possibilities of what our future can look like here in Kentucky based on what's already happening in schools across the state. So like at our hearing last weekend, Sherry McPherson, a great educator in Fayette County schools at Lafayette High School, came and spoke to us about the things she's already doing in her classes to instill a sense of civic preparedness in her students. And that's something that, yes, could require legislation, but there are also practices, guidelines, values, morals that teachers and that educators can uphold in their classroom to get us closer to the Rose decision that may not require legislation. So we want to uphold those things. We want to make sure that people are taking an asset-based view of our education system, an affirmative view. And so that's where we move from here.
Boy, that's marvelous. I was pretty devastated that I wasn't able to be at that town hall. Tell me what other highlights kind of came out of that?
Yeah, so we had 4 expert witnesses, Richard Young, who is at Civic Lex, Sherry McPherson, an educator, Carly Mutertes, who is the head of the Civic Education Coalition, former educator in Fayette County, and Fontella Thomas, the director of the Student Y. And I mean, my foremost takeaway is how wonderful our students. They served as examiners, kind of in a role that you would traditionally see a legislator, a lawmaker in a legislative committee hearing. And they were examining these expert witnesses, and they did such a wonderful job at doing that. But what really stuck out to me, I keep coming back to Richard Young's testimony. He talked about how civic preparedness and civic education is more than just learning about the government, learning about political processes, learning about culture and history, which was consistent amongst all our experts. But what he brought up that I thought was so unique was talking about in our education system, we should be talking about civics as a knowing when to call 311 when there's a pothole in the road, knowing who to call when your cat's stuck in a tree, knowing who to call when your neighbor needs help with something, or knowing how to be an engaged neighbor, knowing where the resources are to figure out who's on the board of education and how do I get in touch with them. But instilling in our education system that civic careers are good careers, are careers that we should aspire to. And in this moment, more than ever, when we have seen from the national level this degradation of these careers, that somehow government workers are not virtuous, they're not useful, and they're not something that we should aspire to. And in Lexington, in particular, Richard made the point 3 out of the 5 biggest employers are civic institutions: the University of Kentucky, the county government, and the Fayette County Public Schools. And those are careers that we should frame in that manner, and also let people know that these careers are things that are, let me back up, you don't need to. We oftentimes kind of view it as college or career and technical. And I think in those buckets we miss the arts, but we also miss these civic careers. And I want us as a culture to be able to articulate that being civically minded does not always mean being politically involved. It can mean being involved in your community at large. It can mean helping the people in your neighborhood, helping the people in your family, helping your friends out in a way that is based in community and based in this collective. So I thought Richard articulated that much better than even I can regurgitate it here to you. Yeah, that stuck with me amongst so many other things.
I think that is an incredibly classic soundbite, especially because we are finding ourselves at such a point in our history where polarization is so rampant. Kind of starting with that, where can we just help each other out? Where can we help each other as neighbors be a civically minded good citizen is a really solid foundation to bring people together. I love that. Richard is phenomenal, and he's always coming up with those wonderful things, but that's a particularly stellar one. I love that. So, you and I were talking a little bit about the fact that there are some skeptics out there. What in the world are high schoolers doing messing with, bringing a lawsuit? What do you say to the naysayers that don't understand why it's important for students to be at the root of this?
Yeah. Well, first I would validate their concern, because I had the same concern when the Mikes approached us with this opportunity, which is what is truly possible in today's political environment and really in our information ecosystem at large. When you look at the Rose case in the 90s, what stuck out to me in reading Mobilizing Citizens for Better Schools, which talks about that public engagement process, which led to the Rose decision, which led to the Kentucky Education Reform Act, was that there was a more robust civic ecosystem then than there is now. There were groups of neighbors meeting weekly to talk about what was going on in the state of Kentucky. There were groups in each city that were meeting to talk about how they could influence education policy. And I believe that those groups are still there. They're just the ecosystem that connects them to the student voice team, to then the Kentucky Education Organization, aren't existing anymore. Those ties have been withered. So the possibility of change has become more distant to people. So I acknowledge that. And I understand that to any time that you are going up against the status quo, against in this case, the state government, that there are interested parties that don't want the status quo to change, that want to uphold their relationships with members of the state government or their financial benefits from being a part of the status quo. And so we understood that going into this, that it was a risk to take for those two reasons, that we're coming up against this great mysterious entity that is the status quo, and that we are taking a risk in an environment that has become increasingly risk averse, especially for quote unquote our side. But what Amendment 2 told us, in my mind, was what the state legislature has been serving up for the past decade or so is not something that the people of Kentucky want to eat. And they roundly rejected that in November. Every single county voting no on Amendment 2 overwhelmingly. I think the closest county was McCreary County, and that was still a 12-point victory for the no side. And we felt like, okay, the ball is in our court now. The Kentucky state government has gone on the offensive. They have time after time attacked teachers, attacked students, tried to limit the teaching of controversial topics, tried to limit how the educators can speak about X, Y, and Z, or how much they get paid, or what their pension benefits look like. So it's time for us as pro public school advocates who just ran a uber successful political campaign to put our proposal on the table. So we felt as students, as high school students, this is the best entity to do that, because what are they going to say about teachers unions? Oh, they're self-interested, they're too political, they only want their financial bottom line, which I'm not sure why that should be a disqualifier, but that's what they'll say. And what would they say about CBE, who brought the original Rose case? Oh, they're always suing us, they're blah blah blah. So we thought, well, how are you going to what angle are you going to take with students? We know now, because we've received their motions to dismiss, that they think, oh, these students, this is not actual harm, and these students should be suing individual educators and administrators. But what a terrible point to argue in the public ecosystem. So we're glad to have that battle with them, and they could only have that battle if we brought this case. So we are showing really their true colors, which is we believe that individual educators, individual administrators are falling short. It's not our fault as the system. And they wouldn't had to admitted those things had it been brought by CBE, had it been brought by KEA or JCTA, the three of which are great partners of ours and we greatly respect. So I would say that that is why the student voice team felt compelled specifically to bring this case. And then as an organization, so that we could protect those 13 individual plaintiffs, those student plaintiffs, that it wasn't one student's last name versus Commonwealth of Kentucky. It's the Kentucky Student Voice Team, and we can serve as that entity that takes some of that energy, but also some of that backlash. So, and I would say this, ultimately, we have a example in our not so recent past in the 90s of a time that Kentucky was not just coming together as a collective to better our education system. Yes, we did that, but we became a national model, and 8 other states around the country ended up adopting the Rose provisions. Those states are not our neighbors, Tennessee or Indiana. Those are states that span the spectrum of political ideology, of demographic, of geography. And we ought to, knowing that that is possible, knowing because we've done it before, many of the same people who are a part of the initial Rose decision are still fighting that fight today. So they know that it's possible. We ought to do it when the time tells us it is now. And I think we are seeing in the data that 1 in 5 Kentucky high schoolers does not have access to an arts class. 1 in 5 Kentucky high schoolers has considered taking their lives in the past year. Over 100 individual Kentucky high schoolers go way beyond the 1 to 400 mental health counselor to student ratio. That one, I believe it's around 60% of our students are proficient in reading, and even lower in math by 9th grade. That's unacceptable. And it's not enough to say, well, each year we increase by 4% and then we lose maybe 3% the next year. We need wholesale changes to our education system that mean we're not working from a baseline that's inadequate. And that's to say, our educators, our teachers, the people who work in our schools, we do not hear students come up to us and say, oh, they're not doing their job. They're terrible. On case to case basis, do we hear this? Yes. But what we largely hear is they're under resourced, they're underpaid, they're not adequately supported, and they're given standards and curriculum which are not with in keeping with what is supposed to be provided in those 7 capacities of the Rose decision. So we think on behalf of Kentucky students, but also on behalf of our taxpayers, our educators, and our administrators, it's time for a systemic change.
You are so incredibly eloquent because boy, isn't that the case. It really, really is. And I think about the even the measurements of what we are choosing to measure are not aligned with what the needs of our time are. And so what a courageous thing to do as an organization. And kudos to you and kudos to all of the other adult partners that are helping along there. So this obviously is it's as far as I know, is the first time that you've actually brought legislation. As far as the delving into this area, what do you think the biggest challenges were as far as actually getting it to fruition?
Yeah, I would say what shocked me the most was, and my biggest skepticism was, how in the world are we going to find 13 or more high school students who are willing to sue the state of Kentucky? I know when I was in high school, I probably would have thought I would be gung ho for that, and then I would have sat down with the lawyers and thought, oh, wait a minute, what am I actually doing? Especially because if you're under 18, you have to have your parents sign on. And I know my parents well. They would not have wanted to do that when I was in high school either. So I thought the willingness of the Kentucky Student Voice Team students, but also the many plaintiffs who are part of the case who are not a part of the Kentucky Student Voice Team, who organically reached out to us and got connected and said, oh, I want to be a part of this proactively. Like, yes, I do want to sue them because I have seen the harm. I think that says something about our education system, and not a positive way. I think if people are scrambling to sue because of the quality of education that they've received, then there's something seriously wrong. And we saw this when we filed the case, and when LEX 18 or WKYT would post a link to their news story on their social medias. If you went through and read the comments, there were so many people who were in their 40s or 50s, but also people who were currently in school saying, how do I submit my story? How do I become a part of this case? This has been going on for X, Y, Z many years. So I thought that was going to be a challenge. It ended up not being a huge challenge. And maybe the lawyers would disagree with me on that because they did most of the plaintiff mining. But I would say for me, the biggest challenge is one that we've not faced yet, and one that is theoretical, which is, if we brought this case because we do not trust the state legislature to do their job and to actually improve our education system in a way that is meeting the moment, then we bring litigation. But where does litigation end up ultimately? Back with the state legislature. If we get a favorable court decision, they will tell the state legislature to remedy these unconstitutionalities. They won't, the court doesn't get to create the law themselves, as you know. And so we understand that in the time between now and a decision, something has to change, or multiple things have to change. We cannot, if we were in a super speedy justice system and we received a favorable decision in a week's time, we understand that that mandate would probably not do much to sway the Kentucky state legislature, or that is my great fear. But what I do understand is that in the interim, between now and a decision, we can build the political power, the public power, specifically, to make sure the Kentucky state legislature knows that this decision is telling you to go down this pathway. We don't want it to get to a point where they get a decision and they look and they have like 17 different crossroads to go down. And they say, okay, well, this one's more aligned with our political interests. So let's do this and let's double down on what we've been doing for the past 5 or 6 years. And there's ways to mitigate that in the court by asking for a special master that reviews and goes over the legislation that would be passed in response to a court decision. But ultimately, They could ignore the special master if they wanted to. We're seeing something that happened like that in Ohio regarding gerrymandering. So what we really need to do is to do what we did on Amendment 2, which was speak the language of our politicians, which is electoral, and tell them in that language, here's what we want, here's how we view our public schools. And so do I think that looks like something on the ballot? No. So it can't be a complete and total replication of what happened with Amendment 2. It has to be something more organic where people themselves are deciding, hey, I think I'm going to start having conversations about what I want my education system to look like, because I know that in 3 or 4 years, we might have the opportunity to completely and wholly reconstruct our education system. So at first, it's about let's accept the premise that we have set out, which is we could have a decision that completely changes our education system. Let's accept that that is possible. And let's start asking ourselves, what do we want out of that possibility? What do we want our education system to look like? And it sounds very simple. Oh, just start thinking about what you want. That doesn't sound very revolutionary, but I think it is, because you are suspending your disbelief for a second, saying, okay, let's say this does happen, and we think, obviously we brought this case, so we think it will happen. And then let's say, with that suspended disbelief, what do we want out of it? And I think oftentimes we ask ourselves the question, what do we want? And we put so many constraints on what we think we can have. And we want to tell people here in Kentucky, no, look what happened with the Rose decision. They didn't just say, okay, here, take this part out and this part out, but keep these parts. It was a full scale. This is unconstitutional. You must recreate this. So if we build from the ground up, I think letting people know that, hey, this is a possibility to completely reconstruct our education system, because you have a constitutional right, and because there are high schoolers fighting for that constitutional right. That's a very powerful thing. I think that gets people involved in something, that gets people discussing the case. It gets people empowered because they know their rights, but it also gets people thinking about what they want for their child, what they want for themselves, what an educator wants for the students that they teach. So we believe that first process, or first step in that process, is starting these hearings, having this Rose Revival 2.0 public engagement campaign, where we're moving to start identifying what's possible, what could these solutions look like, and then moving towards rallying around what we've heard from the people of Kentucky and uplifting a vision of our public education system that we can bring to the state legislature and say, hey, we've done the legwork for you. We've traveled the state. We've talked to these partners, and we've come up with a vision that is not infused with political ideology, but is infused with the hopes and dreams of Kentuckians themselves. And I'll hearken back to Amendment 2 just to say, I believe that's what Amendment 2 has done, in the sense that I think it put a political straitjacket on those state legislators for this current session to tell them, okay, you've got to take a step back from types of legislation you're passing to fundamentally overhaul our accountability system or the funding system to make it performance-based funding. They understand now that that's unpalatable. So I think we can accept the premise that our state legislators are not immovable objects. We just have to figure out a way to move them in the time between now and a decision. I think we have the roadmap because we've done it here in Kentucky once before, but it'll require more. The Kentucky Student Voice Team is not the Pritchard Committee. We do not have the apparatus that Pritchard had in the 90s to push forward this public engagement system or public engagement campaign. So we need the support of partners like Pritchard, of KEA, of JCTA, but also of individual community members like yourself, who maybe you're not connected to an education org specifically, but you have a wide swath of connections in your community and your neighborhood with people who are education stakeholders broadly. We cannot just be preaching to the choir. The choir is singing the same hymn that we are. We have got to go into the other churches and expand our congregation and sing in 20 different hymns at the same time and understand that not everything that the student voice team has fought for is going to be what the people of Kentucky want their education system to look like. But fundamentally, what the student voice team is fighting for is those stakeholders, those individuals, those organizations to have a meaningful seat at the table when we restructure our education system as a whole, which we believe we should do.
That is so incredibly powerful. And what an experience, what a life experience for these students who are involved. And again, the bravery strikes me. And they're the ultimate consumers of our education system and can probably best tell us what's working and what's not. And it's wonderful to hear their voices out there. You have given me a lot of good responses to this question, but I want to go ahead and offer the last one. What would you specifically like decision makers to know that we haven't talked about already?
I would like them to know that the student voice team doesn't see them as enemies in this work. I think it's so easy for us to pick out a villain and to say, oh, they have failed their constitutional responsibility. And ultimately, we believe that they have. But they, in this circumstance, is a decades-long group of individuals. It has been Republicans, Democrats, independents, nonpartisan. It has been wholesale, the effect on our education system and the actors which have brought these effects on our education system now. So I want the decision makers of today to know that it's not your fault, but you are in a burning house. And if you sit there and let it burn, even if you didn't strike the match, you are complicit in the burning of that house. So it is a wonderful opportunity for them now to say, hey, we can do what our predecessors did in the 90s and create this generational precedent for young people, but also for our society as a whole to say, we value education so much that we will take this drastic step, and it is drastic, to completely overhaul your education system. Most states never do that, let alone do that twice in the span of 30 years. So I think it's an incredible opportunity for our leaders. One, for them, I mean, I'm reading about all the legislators from the Rose decision, so you can be in history books and you can you can be talked about 30 years from now. But also, the more importantly, you are setting up a generation of students for success both here in Kentucky but nationwide, because you are setting a model for every state, like we did with the original Rose decision, of this is how we can reform. Because make no mistake, Kentucky is not the only state that faces these issues. And you could say on and some of the issues related to achievement and attainment that we've done pretty well compared to our neighboring states. But we can be the only state that has taken this proactive, drastic change to remedy these issues, and so that our neighbors and that the rest of the states in the country and international, to go back to my earlier point, can say this is the model for change, this is the road that we can take, and this was led by students. And I just hope that it doesn't get lost in all this talk of a quote unquote failing education system, that these failures can never be pinpointed on one person, one entity, one body, one organization, but we all have the responsibility to work to remedy those. So it's an incredible opportunity, I think, for our decision makers. I hope they approach it with due diligence. I believe that they will. I understand that they might differ on ideology or pathway or how we get to this North Star, but I believe that they want to get there, that they want the best for Kentucky students. And knowing that, I think this is just an open invitation to them to join this conversation, to listen, but to also to be heard, to tell us what their constraints are.
Well, that is a fabulous call to action to our legislators to really step up and step beyond politics to be statesmen and women.
Absolutely.
That is a perfect place for us to end this conversation, Will. Thank you so much for taking the time, and we will continue to keep pace as things move forward with this legislation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Education Perspectives. Feel free to share your thoughts on our Facebook page. Let us know which education perspectives you would like to hear or share. Please subscribe and share with your friends.